So I would love to welcome everyone to the art lecture series for fall. We have a great lineup of people, weeks 2, 4, 6, 8. We were going to be 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, but Fred Moten had to cancel, sadly. So we're moving the week 7 up to week 8, and that'll be Gail Tremblay and her panel of Native American weavers. So that'll be week 8. So everyone take note. That's even weeks, really easy to follow. I just want to, for those of you who've not attended this series, to let you know that this is a way for us to have live interaction and engagement with people off the campus. We're so far out and isolated on our campus. It's really important that we have some kind of circulation with the world around us, and also with live bodies really talking to us and not watching screens and watching recordings of, but that we have the people in the room and we're in the room together, which is why I'm going to talk a minute about sort of the etiquette of being an audience and how active a role that is. It's not a passive role. So for someone, if you ever have to speak, you want your audience close so you can see them. When they're way up in the back, it's a little alienating, and it shows a sort of mutual, like, they're not quite sure they're in, or they might want to sneak out. So the more we're in together, the more intimate it is. The other thing is that usually the speakers talk for an hour, and then there's like a half an hour Q&A. So that's the time where this becomes a lively interaction. Faculty ask questions, students ask questions. We have a conversation in public. We follow up with what has been addressed for the hour prior. So it's a way for us to really engage in a conversation. So please be active, and it is absolutely not the time to leave. It is not the time when the lecture is over to pack up your bags and exit. So that's just a student etiquette point. Also I'd like to say quickly while I'm doing this sort of business stuff, we are looking for suggestions for speakers for winter and spring. Maybe Chris will have some suggestions for us. So if you have any, please email or tell me, and we'll try to set that up and take a look at how to balance it. Because we have scholars, artists, visual artists, writers, sometimes people that are interdisciplinary. And then quickly, I want to thank the people that help make this happen. There's a lot of labor that goes on to bring a bunch of programs together. So there's the people in Susan Keefe, who does a lot of the space scheduling, reserves this room for us. We have to fight these big, huge science programs that want this room, and fight with them and organize it. So thank those people that organize it. I want to thank Ben Hargett and Raul all of the media techs who are interns who are helping to record these lectures so that we can watch them in the future. And a lot of us assign these. We've had incredible people here, wonderful lectures. So they really make that happen. And so I want to thank them. And then the school does support this. It helps fund. We don't pay a big honorarium, but it makes it possible. So I just want to thank all of them. And then for this fall, so today we have Christopher Paul Jordan, who works in painting, sculpture, social community work, murals, and he'll be talking to us. Week 4 is Rodrigo Valenzuela, who works in photography, video, installation, and also is an alum of Evergreen. Keep hitting this. Week 6 is Susanna Blum, who's a painter. And then week 8 will be Gail Tremblay, who's an Evergreen Emeritus faculty who's teaching this quarter, and she will have a guest panel of Indigenous weavers. I also wanted to make another plug, which is the Geoduck Student Union is really taking initiative to get students involved and collected. We have a tendency to spread out on this campus, and we really need everybody's involvement and love. We need student action and student participation. It's really important. So they're asking for each program or each seminar in each program to elect a delegate to join them for a couple of sessions. There'll be food and stuff to bring you together. And they're hoping that about 125 students will gather together to talk about, student interests and what you want to see on this campus. And then there's a separate thing where you can actually be part of the governance of that, and that's a separate thing, and that's also happening this fall. But I just wanted to alert all of us in our programs to elect one delegate to join and go to those 2 sessions this fall, and we want to hear your voices. We want you to be engaged and participate. So please start that today, and I am going to bring Jerry D'Souza up, who's in the program theory and practice of painting, and she will introduce Chris.
Hi, everybody. So Chris Paul Jordan is a Tacoma-born artist. His work integrates virtual and physical public spaces to create dialogues for disenfranchised communities. The Black community in particular is a focus. He started in Tacoma School of Arts, moving to Pacific Lutheran University, and then went abroad to study in Trinidad, where he actually learned painting. His original focus was in digital art and photography. So a lot of his paintings and sculptures are time capsules for his work in the community. He has a 7,000 square foot panoramic mural from the gallery, #colored, 2017, which he organized, focusing on Black artists around the country and from the Caribbean. But that is now buried in the walls of Carpenters Union building in Tacoma, and it can only be rediscovered through demolition. So his unique works show modern techniques like color inversion to paint utilizing photography and digital edits. He also does sculpture work. His installations and public projects are international. He has works in Trinidad and Tobago, Taiwan, and Mexico. He has work recognitions across the state. One in particular is the Nettie Artist Award, which is one of the state's biggest art awards, and he's one of the youngest to be awarded with such, along with like the James W. Ray Venture Project Award, the John Imber Fellowship, GTCF Foundation of Art Award, and the Artist Trust Fellowship. He currently has a solo exhibition coming forth in the Northwest African American Museum in 2019, and he has a 2-person exhibition that's going to be occurring in the Frye Art Museum in Seattle. So without further ado, Christopher Paul Jordan.
Wow, thank you. And just let me know, is that working? Is that, okay. It's so fun to be here. I watch these all the time. And it's so interesting, like, my brain is doing this thing, like this self-surveillance thing, where it's like noticing me being in a place where I imagine that I'll be in the future online watching this. But actually, I won't be watching this because I never do that. It freaks me out. And it's so weird because like in my body, I hope we're all getting in our bodies, like noticing that we're kind of here in a particular time and space and a particular moment. And what's going to come out of me is going to be kind of a response to this environment, what y'all draw out of me in this particular moment in space, what my anxieties and my habits and my kind of issues allow to kind of transpire and come out. And and so in this particular time and moment, it's kind of strange because I found myself at a loss for words, figuring out what I was going to talk about. Because I'm at this really interesting transition or kind of energetic shift in my work. So we'll kind of see what happens. And strangely, the only way I could figure out how to organize the work was to kind of be tracing my steps backwards from more recent things. And then, so I'll just kind of be going backwards in time. So forgive my brain for how it kind of conjugates things in that process and like might flip things around and so on. We'll just kind of be patient with each other. This work that's up on the wall right now is a poem that is in the book that is organized with the Jacob Lawrence Gallery. The Monday is kind of like book that has a lot of poetry. I think this particular theme was around 21st century Black feminisms, organized by C. Davida Ingram, who's also spoken in this series. And I was actually kind of, I don't know, say frightened when Davida reached out to me to put work into that, because I am not particularly known as a poet, and I've been resisting for years like call of writing, and so I've been in this process of finding ways to approach that fit with within my body, and there's something kind of unnerving about permanence for me. My background, I guess, both in connection to writing and painting, is more so as a street artist. So it's about this kind of genealogy of Black and Latinx writers going back to the Bronx, folks reclaiming public space and putting their names and words and statements, reclaiming control over their environment. And that kind of writing, there's a kind of an ethic of, work gets covered over, and it gets hopefully covered over by work that's better. And so it's been hard to adapt to creating work in ways that is going to be permanent, that's going to be long lasting. And a lot of what you'll see in this is going to you'll see different relationships to permanence. And so how I approached a few of these pieces was actually to put myself back out in the landscape, and using this kind of tape, putting up phrases. This is underneath a freeway in Tacoma in a place called that we call the Underworld. And this piece itself is called Educating Whites. You'll find that my work is really about infrastructure, and about the way that infrastructure sits in relationship to knowledge. The kind of knowledge that's possible is facilitated by the infrastructure that we live in, right? So like Evergreen, there's a particular kind of culture and awareness and spirit and dialogue that becomes possible in this environment where you have a particular approach to conversation. And that's something that I think about a lot. And as an artist, I think a lot about the way that Black artists in this kind of past 30 years have been situated as a kind of a broker of Black experience to white audiences in particular ways. And so I've been really disinterested in that kind of that brokerage, and more interested in what does it look like to be immersed in dialogue with Black audience and Black community. So the most exciting thing to me about being in this talk is the opportunity to speak with the Black people who will stumble upon this in however many ways, and more importantly to the Black people that are here. So I'm really excited about the kind of questions that will come up, and just bear with me. So I spoke at first about graffiti a little bit, and it's kind of, I've been in this process for the past few years of thinking about ways to come back to that part of my practice. I struggled with it for a long time because a lot of times graffiti, it gets really over aestheticized when it's or spray paint as a material. It gets really reduced in the way that it's introduced to art or spoken about. It gets kind of like ghettoized in a particular way, or there's this kind of just energy that's inappropriate to me, or it doesn't fit for me as far as how graffiti is understood in contemporary art. And so I've been trying to find ways to come back to that without focusing on the aesthetics, but getting back to the symbolic nature of how of what this material means to me. It's really important to note, I was getting at it a little bit ago about how, the graffiti art movement really started in a particular place in time, in the Bronx. I mean, we could talk about graffito, and we could talk about like the, millennia of people stumbling onto holy sites, scrawling their names in places, the human impulse to like indicate your being, your name, your identity on a particular space, right? That's just a thing that exists with us anthropologically. But this movement came out actually in a time where there was there was actually a study that really revolutionized epidemiology. It was called a synergism of plagues, and it talks about the burning of the Bronx and how basically through planned divestment of the city of New York from the Black community and from the Latino communities that had been rooted in that space, there was a mass this disinvestment basically gave rise to buildings in disrepair and crumbling and falling apart and burning over and over and over again. And so in a lot of graffiti art, what you'll notice, and sometimes like people's productions or murals or burners, et cetera, you'll notice you'll notice brick walls, you'll notice rubble, you'll notice crumbling, you'll notice things fracturing and falling apart. And I tie that back to this particular environment where this art form was coming out of, where people were saying, well, actually, this is what our surrounding looks like, but we're going to take authority back from it. We're going to take control of what our surroundings look like, and we're going to represent ourselves in our surrounding space. And I guess I've been thinking about what does it look like for me to do that in this moment, in a time where the kind of across the entire U.S., like another wave of what would you call it? Another wave of displacement, another generation of Black communities being moved and divested from. And so as I've been thinking about ways to, basically, this piece was an attempt at a landscape painting. I'm saying this in a really roundabout way to get at the story of how this piece came out. But I was on a landscape. I was in this place called the Reservoir Hill. It's a few blocks away from the house that I grew up in. And on this hill, there is, one of these kind of moments that sticks out for me when I was growing up was there used to be a mental health kind of halfway house that was located there. And one day, a bunch of me and a bunch of my friends were going up to the hill, and we saw this flames. We saw the space in flames, and we were really shocked to find the firefighters were the ones burning the building down. And that was just such a jarring experience for me. Like, what are firefighters doing burning something? That is just so strange. And we tried to see how close we could get. I remember actually stepping inside a part of one of the buildings at a certain point. This space was crumbling. And this particular moment, this must have been, I want to say around 2003. And it's been really interesting for me to trace back that as one of the very first moments of noticing the ways that my neighborhood was being demolished and being prepared for another wave of population to exist rather than us. And so it was really interesting in the studio. What I'm actually thinking about is just, I want to paint this landscape painting. I'm just going to do this piece. I'm going to, document this particular view, which shows it like half of the neighborhood where I grew up, which is called Hilltop. And I'm attempting at painting this painting. I attempt, and I can't get it out. And then I cover it up, and then what's left is this. And then I'm just like, oh, this is what it is, And it was kind of interesting to me how these kind of decay, became the focus. I got into these paintings on styrofoam using the aerosol as like this kind of subtractive material, right? So aerosol has this chemical reaction with styrene where it actually kind of chews away at it. And so what I was doing was kind of I was basically writing my name on these canvases, my graffiti name, which I won't say, but, and I would, I was doing it on large ones, like series of like 4 or 5, then I would figure out how the image fits into it. There's a couple more of these. This next one is called Road. And I was thinking about stormwater runoff and kind of the strange logic around green roofs. And kind of like some of my work is like kind of tangentially environmental, or like thinking, kind of critiquing some environmental actions and from a particular orientation, but I'm trying not to be cryptic, but we'll see what happens. And in this piece, if you walk up to it, if you see it in real life, you find there's these, it kind of came out of the experience I had in Vermont. I was walking down the street. And if you notice, a lot of streets use this retroreflective striping. So road workers take glass beads and they throw them out on the road shortly after they've painted these white stripes along the road. And these beads, the only beads that then end up secure are kind of these ones that are attached to these white stripes, right? And then the water and then the rain and the environment and the roads and the tires and everything will just kind of flush the rest of the beads away. I was noticing a few different experiences walking down roads and finding these, seeing these sparkles in the gutter. And I was like, why is it sparkling in the gutter? Why is it sparkling in the gutter? And it just kept kind of coming up. And then that's when digging further, I found out kind of where that story, where that comes from. And so my work kind of being about infrastructure. Did I say that already? Yeah, that's gonna keep coming up like a lot. And I'm hoping that it gets more meaning the more times that I say it. This one goes with that one. This is called Untitled Storm. I'm gonna show this next one, because this is actually where that series started. This piece is called Landscape Without Anthropics. And it was inspired by Chanda Sue Prescott Weinstein, a Black astrophysicist, has this research about the beginning of the universe, essentially, and the anthropic principle and kind of different ways of getting around the. Does anybody know like what the anthropic principle is about in here? Basically, the anthropic principle is like this astrophysics concept that's like, it's this argument. Basically, astrophysicists ran out of ways to explain why the universe is the way it is. They kind of got to this like ceiling point, right? And so basically some people just started to say, well, the universe is the way it is because that's the only way it could be. We see the universe that supports human life because we're human life, and the only kind of universe that we could observe is a universe that would support our life, right? So it's this cyclical like relationship or dialogue with the kind of universe that we can occupy and the kind of universe that is as a result of our being, right? And a lot of my work is in that kind of a dialogue where I'm thinking about who am I? How am I possible as a being within a certain kind of environment or condition or infrastructure? And yet, astrophysicists are deeply frustrated with that particular argument because it's not an explanation in the way that they like. And so a landscape without anthropics, what does it mean to see an environment? What does it mean to observe a universe in which you are not possible? And for me, I've been in this process of negotiating. How I even got into landscape painting was just this kind of battling with the simultaneous nostalgia and dysphoria of seeing my surrounding environment, right? When I walk down the neighborhood, and when I walk down the streets and I see so many things that are now rubble, which once were thriving, when I see so many things that were occupied and lived in by the people that I grew up with, now being a very different kind of a space and being purposefully run into the ground so that so that it can be claimed at the lowest possible prices for another kind of occupant. What is it? How would I document both this mourning that I feel, along with trying to honor and celebrate the memory that I have the gift of having. And landscape painting for me is such a kind of within the Western tradition, it's just so disgusting to me, like the ways that it's kind of approached as this like apolitical space, it's just like a landscape. There's no backstory to this. There's no, our sense of like the pristine environment, the pristine natural landscape is it's just beauty. This is just nature's beauty. And it's been really exciting over the past few years seeing so much more knowledge from indigenous communities surfacing that deals with how actually the maximum amount of biodiversity and what it means to cultivate the landscape is so much about how we as humans interact in dialogue with that landscape, and how indigenous communities have preserved and created and given form or given opportunity to the maximum amounts of diversity that that the landscape can usher forth through their stewardship of the landscape. So our national parks really falling into disrepair, like falling into it's just completely unbalanced and chaotic spaces because the indigenous communities that are intertwined with those histories have been kicked off of the land, and so. When I kind of got the very first spark of this, I was riding on a train from New York so again, train, like infrastructure, it's always coming back out, right? I was riding on a train from New York to Vermont, and I was looking out the window, like I always do, and it was really interesting just watching graffiti that surrounds the train space. There's different traditions, so there's different styles, especially in the Northeast. And I was just watching these different styles, and I was watching it getting further out. You're riding the train, and you're seeing all of these names, all these words, all these things pass you by. And the train is going, deeper and deeper into the outskirts of the city, and then you're seeing this industrial backdrop, is the next wave, and then you get further and further, and you get to that kind of what would be a kind of a pristine environment, so to speak, and yet the only thing that really speaks back to the existence of the city or the urban space is that no matter how far you go out into the wilderness, there's still graffiti that traces its way along these train lines, and that juxtaposition for me between this really raw energy, human energy, affixing itself to the landscape, and then you have this quote unquote pristine environment right behind it. That was like something I was trying to replicate in these pieces. And so people who know me or who know what I write, who are connected to that part of my history, can see my name in these etchings. I was thinking about graffiti as a form of scarification, actually, and this piece is called "The Last Generation of Scarification in Africa." It was kind of in dialogue with, and that's a name I've taken from a series of. It's a photo documentary series that was exploring the stigma that particularly in Nigeria, Black indigenous folks who live outside of the metropolitan areas who use traditional scarification as a form of community recognition and dialogue. And how essentially within this kind of Western beauty standards and colonial beauty standards, how scarification is seen as a form of blight on the body. And so this photo documentary series, Last Generation of Scarification in Africa, traces through the different ways that these elders, whether or not they will allow their children to continue that tradition, right? Whether or not they will allow them to represent their faces and connect them to that history and that genealogy. And seeing for me the ways that scars can be taken both with pride and with shame, seeing that divergence or seeing that frame, that's something I kind of think about the ways that graffiti as a kind of evidence of Black presence, right? As evidence of a particular community or identity or name, how it might be interpreted in different ways. There's this really funny, and even just the idea of human presence in general. I was going to tell a story, but I'm actually going to skip it. Moving a little further into some old ish stuff. This piece is called Ethnic Fest. So Ethnic Fest is this festival that happens in my neighborhood. And it actually is a festival that was created after something called the Black Festival. So there was this thing called Black Festival. It used to happen at Stanley Park. And it was a cultural festival. It was one of the biggest festivals in the city for years. But basically the city created Ethnic Fest to be, you kind of hear that and you're like, what the hell? Like, what? Like, really? That's what it's called. The city created that as their idea of making a more inclusive version of this. Like, Black Festival is excluding people somehow. And so Ethnic Fest had, when I grew up in the era of Ethnic Fest, right? So this is when like all of the colonized peoples come together and share their cultural forms in this space. But like, and so when I grew up going to Ethnic Fest, you know, just take it as a thing. It's in this place called Wright Park. And, you know, at Ethnic Fest, there's one of the coolest things to me about it was that you had the biggest basketball games really that would ever happen in the neighborhood would be that like annual game at Ethnic Fest, right? So it's this huge court. It's packed with like, I don't think they were sticking to like team limit numbers. There's probably like 20 people in any given game, and then there's like hundreds of people surrounding the court. That's the memory of Ethnic Fest that I grew up with just hundreds of Black folks surrounding this particular game, and the game would probably be one long run-on game that would go from 9 a.m. till 10 p.m., you know, and so, you know, I grew up kind of like running from basketball. Like, there's this thing that I wasn't good at and wasn't inclined to, but like, but still getting to witness that has been awesome. And a few years ago, so I have a volunteer day job where I run a community center, and we were invited to do basically have a breakdance battle on the basketball courts. And, you know, when I got that invitation, I was like, that's strange because the basketball courts are occupied. Like, you know, why would, you know, so anyways, we was like, well, we could probably find a different space, but we'll be willing to definitely participate this year. So we bring all of our stuff down. We get to the spot, and there's a ton of, and then there's room for us to set up off of the courts so that the courts can still have their game going. And so we set up our breakdance battle like station and our DJ and everything away from the courts. And I get there and there's these kids. I noticed that the hoops have been covered with these like strange like muzzle-like contraption where this cardboard frame has been like built specifically to keep kids from being able to play basketball. And it was this like really jarring thing, like what is that like on there and what's going on? And so, but even more kind of like disturbing or, you know, just tough was that the kids they wanted to play so bad. So they're literally shooting bricks just right off of this rim, even though it's covered. That's like how much they want to play. And so I get there and I'm like, absolutely not. Like, we're going to take this down so you guys can play. Like, we don't need this space. Like, so we take the covers off. And then the Metro Park security starts freaking out. They like rush us all, and they're like, no, you can't have basketball. Like, it starts brawls, like there starts fights, all these things happen. And I'm just like, so what? Like, if people are that energized about basketball, let's facilitate something around it. Like, let's create this space. But ultimately we weren't allowed to support the basketball, even though there was nothing else happening there. And so it's been strange over the past few years in my neighborhood, noticing. So I painted this piece based just off of a photograph that I took. Taking a photograph in that moment was the only way I could think of processing and relaying what that moment was about. But I had been for a few the past few years finding fallen hoops around my neighborhood, and I was like, why am I encountering all these fallen basketball hoops? Just like, driving down the street, or like, I remember this particular instance, this is right by the elementary school that I grew up in, and I actually know the house where this hoop came from. And so it has been this thing that was happening regularly, and I'm like, why are these hoops in this position, in these places? It's like I can't get away from them. And eventually, I come back to, let's see, what do I have on here next? I come back to, I come back to this salvage yard, which is a place that's right across the alley from the house I grew up in. My family actually lost the house this year, and on the Christmas of probably 1996, my parents gifted us a basketball hoop. It was our family present. And I remember being so excited about it because all my siblings were excited, but I was actually like, I don't really care about this, but everybody else is happy, so let me celebrate. The only moment where it clicked to me what was happening was coming back to the salvage yard across the alley from my house just a few weeks after the house was sold, and our hoop was down. So coming to an understanding around displacement and how the landscape, the kind of runoff, so to speak, of our cultural and physical landscape was precipitating in the form of these collapsed and fallen hoops throughout the community. And that's when I very first started to really understand what was going on. Then maybe a month or two after, Gwen Jones. Gwen is probably the most important person who I have the opportunity to collaborate with in my practice. She's the person that I paint more. That I have more portraits of her than I have of anyone else. And Gwen, she runs this salvage yard, which I'll get further into the story about in a little bit. But Gwen called me. She's like, Chris, there's a house that's been demolished across the alley from me. I want you to come and see what's going on. So I come over to Gwen's home, and there's this, one of the houses, there's been several houses burning down on this particular street, or fires happening somehow. And then the houses are being condemned, and then, who knows what's happening. But, and then different things are being built, right? So, the backdrop of this is basically essentially Seattle's housing crisis spilling out into the region. And I think Tacoma was the number 2 in the country for rental rate increases recently, so only behind Colorado. Even Warren Buffett's holding company has its names on properties in Tacoma. The margin of increase, the margin of wealth creation that's made possible by the kind of undervaluing of the historic Black community in those spaces is so large that these mega capitalists are in a land grab for this space. And so experiencing that from a human perspective is interesting. And so Gwen had me come and photograph this, the kind of ruins of this home. And as I'm there, looking at it, and then I come, and then there's this basketball hoop right next to it. And lo and behold, the rim has been taken down. And I asked Gwen, how recently did that happen? And she's like, maybe a month or 2 ago. So it's just seeing all the different edges, I guess, of this experience and trying to document and capture that has been something that's going on for me and kind of been my interest in the landscape. But I can't capture the tragedy of it without also understanding the underlying beauty that is the history of my neighborhood. And Gwen is definitely a huge catalyst for that. Coming over to this salvage yard, which is this place where, I just thought of it as a bunch of interesting things, right? Like these windows and these, all of these interesting objects that I could encounter in this space. And, her father, Mr. William T. Jones, was a Buffalo soldier, and he kind of knew how to fix everything. Strangely, yeah, we have some funny stories that, but I have been so this is a portrait of Gwen, who she's carried on the tradition of glass cutting. And so this work goes back like before like Earthwise and these like this kind of like white eco spaces like existed, like Black folks were surviving and maintaining through resourcefulness, recycling, like repurposing things as a way of living. And you'll see like histories of architecture that's deeply attached to that. And it's really interesting to me now because this space is really my closest thing to home, coming back to this salvage yard. And so I've been documenting that. And it's weird because I've recently uncovered older photographs I had taken there from about 10 years ago. This is another picture of Gwen and a painting of Gwen. Another big thing for me is like time capsules. So, and trying to support like intergenerational collaboration. So like, I recently kind of came back to these negatives that I had left unprocessed for about 10 years, and so I am like, okay, well, let's see what's on these. And I found these pictures this is, I guess, of me taking a picture of myself, I think. And it was weird because like stumbling into these photos was like it's like looking back on your life through like the eyes of a ghost almost. Like you're reconstructing moments forensically, right? Because you don't remember when it actually happened. But there's something about an image being taken out of the timeline and then reintroduced that kind of does something different with the mind. And I was interested in that. I was interested in the idea of latency and this kind of time delays between cause and effect, and how an image can rest unprocessed for 10 years, and then what does it mean to me now? And so what you'll see, this is me standing on the roof of my home, and then this is a salvage yard located behind there. This is another photo, and this is basically the opposite direction. So this is just facing outward from the roof of my parents' home. And I also got interested in like documenting the salvage yard stereoscopically. So I was doing these photos that you can see in 3D. I don't have things for everybody today, so we'll skip that. But there's something about seeing things three-dimensionally that I think is connected to memory in a very interesting way. So it actually kind of physically puts you in the space, and I was trying to figure out how to recreate that feeling. Basically, that work ended up going into this temporary installation at the what do you call that place? The Olympic Sculpture Park. Yeah, they'll be mad at me for kidding. I was interested in like 3D stuff, and how like 3D has been this thing that has wanted to happen forever, right? So originally when photography was invented, they wanted to do 3D photography. Like I don't know, like, so you can find stereoscopic images from like that are like over 100 years old, that are like, you can find stereoscopic images of like people picking cotton, like Black folks you can find like them that old, like really old. I don't know the particular specific years, but it's very, very long tradition. And it's always thought that it was going to revolutionize everything, right? So it's always been like, 3D, this is gonna be the new optical revolution. There's people who were doing 3D paintings in the 70s, like stereoscopic paintings. And then like you have virtual reality is this another wave of like, we think we're going to revolutionize life by 3D art. And I was interested in like kind of this, again, that nostalgia and dysphoria, right? So like, how this thing that has wanted to happen forever but has never happened, and I don't know if it ever really will in the ways that it thinks that it will, because we live in 3D and we're totally, it's like kind of a normal thing for us. It's cool like when you, oh cool, but I don't think it'll ever be as like efficient or as like as just like a regular picture, like a one-eyed picture. But thinking about that, thinking about cycles of displacement, cycles of forced migration, cycles of, and how like, basically, Black folks in the history of my neighborhood have been moved across every single part of the city of Tacoma. They've been pushed from one side of the town to another. And I was thinking about that in the national context, how like, arrive like these different areas of forced migration, and how basically we're in this process where we've been pushed to every extremity of this country, like every extremity of this land. And now you have, with this layer of displacement, you have a lot of Black folks moving in masses back to the South. And a kind of a parallel part of my practice that I'm not going to get into as much today is about really life expectancy, particularly as it crystallizes around HIV and AIDS. And what's really frightening for me is seeing my community pushed to places that have no healthcare infrastructure, right? So pushed back to spaces that that are not invested in any ways of supporting their life. And so thinking about how things move in cycles, I was interested in creating this piece is like a ritual work where you approach it and you switch through this knob, and it rotates you through this north, south, east, west incantation, kind of a entreatment of the cardinal directions, and basically it has a kind of an affirmation built into it with each direction that's associated with. The piece is still at University of Puget Sound. If y'all want to go check it out, it'll be there for a couple more weeks. But going back further, that nostalgia, that strangeness, the bizarreness of how I was encountering the environment. I was taking these photographs through glass that I had gotten at the Jones Yard. And that's where this whole kind of landscape thing started off for me. This picture is taken across the street from the community center that I run. And all of these were. And that space that we were in formerly was actually just a couple months after taken away from us. So we had been in there 6 years at that time. And that shift basically was what got me really interested in what would it look like to reclaim and salvage and engage with Black space in a way that would connect us to the future. It's another weird picture where like I came across, it's like, I think, just like, I don't know, weird bathroom photo, selfie thing. I'm gonna go into this, I'm gonna do a video if I can. And do the lights come off for that part if we do that? Okay, so I'm gonna do a video that will go into this next piece, and then I'm gonna circle around and make everything make sense. So give me a second. We'll see if this has sound or not. So yeah, that video was documenting this project called Color 2017. Basically, this huge building called Carpenters Union Building was getting ready to be demolished, and I had the opportunity to do something with it. And so I called together about 35 Black artists from the U.S., from Trinidad, from St. Kitts, from a few different places, and kind of pairing together Black artists and poets to kind of be in dialogue and take all the artist statements, things like that, off of the table and just let the work exist in community in a different kind of a way, and facilitate some dialogue around that. I think what I said a bit before about brokerage is that my issue with a lot of the group Black art shows that are put out or tour the country is that essentially it doesn't matter. You can get as many Black artists on the walls of the museum as you want, but until the Black audience becomes a center or a focal point, the discourse is always going to be constrained. It's going to be strangled, but in a particular way, right? By a certain gaze and by the limitations of that. Can you imagine if the future of astrophysics relied on people like us understanding what was happening in order for things to move forward, right? Like, it's like, yeah, maybe every once in a while you come back and translate something, or you come back and say a little bit about what you're doing, but ultimately you kind of got to trust the experts to let things get to where they're trying to go. And I want the same kind of freedom, the same kind of liberty to exist, actually probably more deeply inspiring forms of liberty and freedom to exist around the way that Black art progresses. And so that's why I see my practice as really being about infrastructure, right? Like creating infrastructures for dialogue for dislocated people. And I use that word dislocated rather than disenfranchised, particularly because I think that it's the dislocation is the issue, not, when we have sovereignty over our space and our bodies, we have really all that we need. So that's what I'm really interested in, is what kind of knowledge transpires from environments where Black audiences and Black artists come together. And it was really kind of remarkable to be entrusted in that project with the opportunity of creating the container for that dialogue. And so thinking about how to do that, it was like kind of curating the show. I was the only person who knew the work that was going to be coming in. And to create the container, I was trying to paint this panorama of murals to surround the space. And each of them was in dialogue with different works from other artists throughout the exhibition. This is another portrait of Gwen Jones. You can almost see her carrying this large window pane. This is a portrait of one of my students from Trinidad and Tobago, who, when I asked him if he would, pose as what he wanted to be when he grew up, he made himself a paper sword and shield. I thought that was so interesting. I was like, okay, I got to paint this mural in dedication to him. And so this is actually how that mural looks to the natural eye. And the idea is kind of me going back to my history as a digital artist, was thinking about the interface, right? Digital media infrastructure, and how the realities that we experience through the filtration of these human networks, social media, all of these hashtags, all of these lenses, all of these filters. And thinking about, I guess in a way, this question of a lot of times I think for myself, and maybe perhaps, and when I'm reading about a lot of Black art history, I'm reading oftentimes about issues and grappling with negative portrayals of Black people. These ideas of negative portrayals, these kind of racist caricatures that exaggerate certain features that seek to dehumanize. It's a representational violence, essentially, that's committed against Black bodies. And the need for that type of violence in order to sustain the kind of cultural, the kind of colonial economies that we have, right? And so in this space, I'm kind of imagining, I guess, what really is a negative image, right? What really is a negative portrayal outside of the context of white supremacy? And if we look actually at Black representation and how we have represented ourselves and each other without this kind of invasion and this kind of taking away sovereignty over our bodies, it's almost impossible to have a connotation of what a negative image, I guess, would be or is. So people walk into this, and I'm really interested in people looking at things twice, right? So like people walk into this space and they're kind of like, what is going on, or whatever. And then they look around for a while, and then we kind of gave them the information about how to translate the work. So really basically on any phone, like if you kind of go into your like accessibility features, and you can like change your like display accommodations and invert your colors, and then you can see through your camera like everything looking like weird or different. And that's kind of how people walk around the show, and so experiencing things on these like digital and physical planes, I guess. This is another picture of one of my students from Trinidad, so you can kind of see that interaction there. And I was really interested in how like the audience would document the experience, and how they would archive it, and how they would translate it and share it with the world, right? So there's so many Black artists who were a part of the project who didn't get to be there physically, right? So what's it like for them to be able to experience the work from where they are, and kind of that kind of, I guess, like Black vicarity is something I've been kind of into as well. So yeah, and then this is an image. Yeah, you kind of get it. Let's see. Another one. This was picture. I had come across this. I do collages and collect like National Geographics and things like that, and then I had torn this image of Ruby Bridges out from one of the National Geographic magazines. So in this part of the piece, I'm kind of like holding that picture up to the light, and you can see the ink from the backside of the page and how it's like, impacting the image itself. This other picture of like a wrestler, sometimes pixelating things. I don't know. There's a long story to that, but like you can ask me about it, I guess. And then this is like one of my favorite parts of the installation. I will show you in a second where these drawings came from. It was interesting when I told my dad that we were doing this project at the Carpenters Union. He started crying, and he told me about like, the Carpenters Union was a place, in terms of like Black labor, like in the time where he had migrated to Tacoma, that was like the last place that he would ever go. There was just no way. And really, when you look at the history of union organizing, it's really deeply it's really transpiring out of anti-Blackness, right? And this need for white working class people to secure, to keep out Black labor, so looking at labor, looking at like those histories, it was particularly interesting for this place to be, this building to be kind of fallen into disrepair, and for us to be like reclaiming it and reimagining it for this kind of temporary period of time. And my favorite, I think of my work as being kind of animated by performance in a way of like, how much time do I even have?
We're almost still 27 minutes.
I have 27 minutes left to talk?
Including Q&A. Yeah, Q&A.
Oh, This is kind of fun. This is getting to the fun part for me. So like, I think about my work as being animated by performance. And why I say that is, if you look at a lot of the artifacts, Black, Indigenous, sculptural forms, ceremonial pieces that have been stolen, and that are in museums all across the world. There's this history of they're having a ritual history to them, right? They're having an interactive aspect to them. And the thing that I guess that I've been wondering about is, what would it be like to reactivate those works within the ritual paradigm in which that they were originally intended. And so for me, the work is a kind of a prompt. It's it's a context. It has its own way of being activated. And this piece, Sharis Bailey is doing this performance that opens up the entire exhibition. So it was really interesting being able to document the space in the inverse and how people would use their phones and be experiencing, because ultimately, right, like you're seeing the work, but after a certain point, it's playing with what you're seeing. So you're seeing each other ultimately, and you're seeing each other as part of the work. And you're seeing each other through the lens of your phone. So now you have to grapple with the fact that there's this filtration going on. But then you're also seeing each other completely different than how you normally would. And the light is black, right? You have black light shining and illuminating things. Like you have just different interactions and experiences around light that shape different kinds of relationships. And so seeing people interact within that in space was really interesting for me. I'm going to go back a little bit further into, this is another portrait of Gwen. I actually hated painting when I originally started working with brushes at first. It was a process for me to get into it. I felt like painting with brushes was like really inconvenient. Like it's like, to me, spray paint is like you have the color, you shake it up, and that is instantly what it is. Like you know what it is. Like in a brush, you have to like re-dip them. Like I was like really like, what is that? I don't like to dip this back, you know. So this is where I was getting into the I had. Okay, so this piece, I'll just start with the basics, was painted. This is a portrait of the community center of students at the community center that I run. And I was doing an exercise with my students around perspective drawing. So the activity was having them take in turns posing and modeling so that they could practice different ways of engaging with perspective. And with children, oftentimes perspective, it's a complicated thing to deal with, to translate onto a two-dimensional surface. It's kind of you're like lying to yourself when you're drawing something 3D onto a two-dimensional surface. And so they don't like to do that. They like to put things the way that they are. And so there's this frontal orientation that all images take on when they're oftentimes when they're translated by young people. And so I had to allow them to see other ways of translating that, do this activity, and get them drawing things from the side, and really challenging them to draw only what they can see with their eyes, to draw very optically. And so these drawings actually, what was funny was, so these are the drawings on the walls, are the drawings that they made in that moment. What's interesting about these drawings is that these are all the same person. And after a few different rounds of the activity, what I found was that the students were drawing each other and taking the opportunity to elaborate on what they saw in each instance of drawing. And so we get finished with the activity, I get around to their drawings, I'm like, what is going on? But yeah, they're sideways, and that flipping of them is how they saw that moment. And I thought that was pretty exciting. So that portrait, though, was painted in the community center. This portrait was painted in August of 2016, and by December was the month where where the landlords decided that they didn't want us to occupy that space anymore. We had been renting it at that time for 6 years. So the landlord, who's a pretty major developer in Tacoma, had another kind of venture that he wanted to grandfather into the space. And so us and this is the same summer, about maybe a dozen other community organizations lost our spaces along Martin Luther King Avenue in Tacoma. And so for me, this idea of time capsules and how can I archive these experiences and these moments is really interesting and important. And so these murals, this 7,000 square foot one, I think, as Jerry mentioned, is kind of now it's behind the walls of this building. So the walls are built around it, and it's kind of stuck in there. Like you can't see it unless the building is torn down or the walls are torn down. And it's interestingly been happening again. So this mural was painted originally as a temporary mural out of sight in Seattle and King Street Station. And then I was just gonna be there for 2 weeks, really. And I, as a formerly graffiti muralists, like we deal with that temporariness. It's just a part of the game. It's going to be there for a moment, and you need to cherish it while it's there, and then it's gone. But over the period of this piece coming up, basically there was about 12 other art shows that happened in that space, and each time the person running the space was like, do you want to paint over it? And people would be like, no, we want to keep it. When I painted this, it was easy for me to kind of take it for granted because, the community center was still there. It still existed, By December, that physical space no longer existed. And so for that time forward, for people to be continuing to preserve this artwork, it kind of gained more and more kind of sacred significance to me. And basically, I guess just officially about a month ago, it was determined that the piece would be preserved by way of again encapsulating it into the wall. So they built a wall around the work and over the work, so it's not visible. No one can see it or get it. But who knows, in 150 years or so, what people will stumble onto. This was one of the earlier paintings, which is kind of a similar version to that. I was facilitating the same activity with my students in Trinidad. And so they're around these triangular tables, and they're taking turns drawing each other. And it was really only this moment that prompted me to document the moment when I was in Tacoma. I was like sitting there, and I was doing the class, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is the same picture. I needed to take a picture of this. So I did. I guess I'm retracing my steps back to the beginning of me working with paint. And brushes, which is me being in Trinidad. I was called on to do a mural with these elementary age students, which was all great. I was gonna get my whole semester's credit just getting to do this project in the community. And then the only thing was that I didn't know how to paint with brushes, and nobody else knew that. So basically, we got to collaborate, me and these youth, and kind of learn together. And so essentially what I did was had them take photographs of each other, posing as what they wanted to be when they grew up. Then I kind of collaged them together, and they painted everything that was flat. I guess we walked up to the wall, and I was just like, I guess it's kind of like drawing with color. So we just kind of started drawing, and I was actually shocked how it came out. Coming back to Tacoma a few months after that, I had the conviction to want to do more art experiences that connect the U.S. and Caribbean Black communities. And I had, by that time, actually gotten addicted to the process of painting. So it's interesting now, circling back, this painting is based on a photograph that I took on my return trip to Trinidad, where they were doing masquerade in the schoolyard that day. And so I took this photograph and then created this painting. It's actually painted on a window screen. During that trip, what I realized was that I had this interest in coming back to this ritual origins around Black cultural production and a kind of a spiritual infrastructure, I suppose, like this idea of when you look at, this is another painting, which is a painting of the church, kids of the church that I grew up in. The idea I'm trying to build up to and end on is that essentially, when you look at the landscape at large, in any kind of urban space around the U.S., you'll find that the remnants of a displaced Black community, the Black church is kind of the last physical kind of vestiges of that community, which exists in the urban environment, and that's kind of shaped by a lot of like economic policy factors, whereby which the state kind of controls the opportunity for Black ownership of space in general. But so the churches being these last things that remain so often, I got interested in this idea of what would it look like to reimagine and reclaim reclaim that space, to further indigenize and to imagine a Black interfaith environment. I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but I guess the thing I've been interested in is what does it look like to have an environment built around the Black church is one of the few spaces that that Black folks interact across class backgrounds. It's one of the few spaces where we offer our talents back to our community without cost. It's one of the few spaces that intergenerationally people are able to connect and interact. And it at the same time there's this history of colonial violence that underpins and shapes the kinds of interactions and knowledge transmission that's possible within that environment. So for me, where I'm at now, and why it's interesting for me to be here now, is I'm in the process of developing these church prototypes, so to speak, which are essentially trying to model a reimagining of a Black church as a Black interfaith space that's centered around queer community, and where we come to a different understanding about the potential, the possibilities of seizing and reclaiming our relationship to the urban environment, but that and putting our spiritual discourse back in connection with our physical sovereignty in diaspora. One of the things I didn't get to was that my dad is a pastor, and how I ended up here in Tacoma was through my family being sent to a small mission church located in Hilltop, a few blocks away from the house I grew up in. And so I think about that relationship, again, of infrastructure and knowledge and dialogue. And I guess it will be interesting over the next few years to see how these church prototypes kind of end up. So this particular mural was painted at a place called Black Zone. Similarly, a kind of a artifact from that space. Black Zone was a temporary negotiation with Vulcan in Seattle at the intersection of 23rd and Jackson, where it was decided they were going to tear down this entire plaza of businesses that were kind of a center point, a focal point of the Black community in the Central District, and as to kind of appease or work with or collaborate with the community, this Black Zone space was created as a temporary environment where artists and folks would come together and do projects and events. And so I was asked to do a mural at Black Zone. I decided to paint it on this pegboard wall because it was a wall that we could actually physically take down and keep with us. And it's interesting now, if you look at, so this whole place has been now demolished, but if you look back on Google Maps, you'll see that it's still there, and digitally, it's virtually still there. And it's very interesting doing that kind of backtracing, especially in this moment. I had a screenshot, but I didn't include it from the colored exhibition, and you can see that place being demolished as well. So I guess I'm interested in the ways that Black cultural production exists on the cusp of this redevelopment, like continually, and what does it mean to kind of preserve or to archive those spaces and those experiences. This last slide is a template for the first Church of Black Liberation prototype. So I'm going to end it there. Totally. Yeah. And I'm totally into the spaciousness of dead air. So we don't have to feel nervous about that at all. Absolutely, yeah. That's a good question. That's a tough one too. So the question was, do I see my landscape painting as a grieving process and as a process of letting go? And if so, what am I letting go of? Yes, absolutely letting go. What I think I'm letting go of, and what I didn't understand at first I was letting go of, was basically, I think, I find my community right now in time figuring out what does it mean to form intentional Black space outside of the context of segregation. So in the segregation era, you have these confines. You have a community that is structurally required to forced to work together, forced to be together, forced to, whenever my parents come from one church service to visit one in another city, there's people who already know them who will have them stay in their homes because they will not be allowed to stay in any of the hotels, right? There's an interdependence and interreliance that is rooted in survival, and it predetermines a certain kind of level of awareness of your community and connection to it. I think what I'm mourning. What I'm mourning is the loss of that space, but what I'm mourning and I'm letting go of are two different things, right? What I'm mourning is the loss in lives. You see how in life expectancy crystallizes across zip codes, right? So you can see the disparities of Black communities in decades, in terms of decades, how much shorter Black lives are than average, but and that's become because of a lot of different factors, but which I won't get into that. I don't have time. But I guess what I'm saying is I'm letting go of the idea or a relationship to community that is not intentional, so or that is reactive or that is responsive. So I'm letting go of the comfort of that can come with taking your community for granted and assuming that you'll have the surroundings that you have. I'm letting go of that and moving into a space of intentionally trying to form these spaces, intentionally trying to create these environments where different kinds of interactions and relationship become possible. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Oh yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I mean, so how big were the pieces? The very first pieces, I kind of moved from smallest to larger, and then I moved from driest to more wet. Those first pieces that I showed were around I would say 4 feet by 4 feet. To that mural, that panoramic mural, I think, as Jerry mentioned, is the largest one that I've done just as a individually, and that was 7,000 square feet. So that was 20 feet tall. And I don't even remember the length dimension if I were to measure it circularly. But on average, they were 20 feet tall with about 25 foot wide of excerpt from them. So yeah, it's actually funny because I like painting that way. It's more comfortable for me to paint large because of my background, right? So painting on a small little thing is ugh. How do you, yeah. What was the process like of painting the filter paintings? It was weird, and I actually didn't know that I was going to show people how to interact with them after. That was kind of accidental. So what happened originally was I was painting them from the inverse, and what's interesting is human beings have in our eyes more like red cones that absorb light than blue ones, right? So we are more attuned to the subtle differences between oranges and reds and browns than the subtle differences between blues. If you really look at the wide range of colors that we refer to as blue, it's extreme, it's tons of different colors that are in there. And what's really strange about painting people in the inverse is that you get an attunement and a sensitivity to the variations of blues, and you start to see very, very differently. That's an interesting sentence in itself. But so you're kind of embodying a different way of relating to the surface of other bodies, and you. So I was. At a certain point in time, I usually just paint from my photographs. So I'll take my cell phone. That's how I do my murals. So I take my cell phone, I put a little grid on them. I walk up to a wall, put the grid up, and then I paint from there. And I just, through error and correction, I get it right. At a certain point, I just put the filter on my phone so that I could just paint it in real time. And then I was like, oh, this is interesting. It's kind of weird. I like being in two places at once. And then I was like, oh, it would be interesting to share this with other people. So that's what happened. Yeah, actually, that's a good question. I do. Most of the photographs are taken with my phone. And what's really funny is when I'm usually organizing a show or thinking about painting, or it just happens by coincidence. Like when I take a picture, I'm not thinking it's going to be a painting. I just have it's just a reaction. Like, I'm going to document this moment. And then like a year or 6 months later or something like that, I'll be going through my iPhoto and like going through things, and I'm like, whoa, like what is that? And like, whoa, I need to like paint this. And then that's where the ideas kind of come from. So it's always this like coming back to something, and then it comes out later. It's kind of weird. Oh, that's a tough one. The question was, how often do I take a photo that I know I'm going to paint? What's interesting, in some ways, I'm kind of a scarred photographer. Like, so like, so I guess what do I mean by that? I was traumatized by the educational process in a particular way that changed my relationship to photography. I didn't learn to paint. I didn't learn to draw even until I was maybe 18. And I started out as a digital artist first, and I was doing a lot of photography at the time. But I didn't like the way that my instructors thought about photography. So my impulses as a photographer are kind of stunted, and I'm actually just in the past couple of years been trying to heal that, whatever that is. But also the kinds of painting I'm interested in are not things you will very rarely find frontal paintings from me, or things that are like head on, or things where someone knows they're being photographed. They're usually more candid moments that I'm looking for. And so in some ways, even my awareness of the subject can cloud or disrupt that opportunity. So it's almost like probably the only way that these things will come into existence is like by accident. Like I accidentally don't know this is worth capturing, and other people accidentally don't realize it either. And then it just kind of ends up happening, and then it's there. But I guess the only thing I can do intentionally, right, in order to ensure that these paintings take place or documentation happens, is to immerse myself in Black community in an intentional way. Being in the spaces where these moments transpire is really the only way that the documentation becomes possible. So maybe one more question? Oh, did you? Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, okay. Okay, so what drives me? Why is painting important to me? And how does it differentiate from photography for me? What even is the value of translating a photo into a painting, right? If it's just easier as just a snap. I guess the only way that I've found to think about it is that in the painting process, I'm embodying the image, that it physically moves through me. And so I see the painting process as downloading a memory into physical moment. And so I think a lot about compression artifacts. This is getting into like weird stuff that I don't know if anybody cares about this stuff. But so compression artifacts, when you take a JPEG, the way it kind of distorts the image in order to translate it into something that can be easily processed. So I think about the kind of painting as a process of compression. And I get into like how all of these different gestures come together, these simplifications of a moment come together in order to create this tapestry of an image. And I really appreciate you asking that, because maybe it's a thing that I care about in ways that I don't think I can share. You know what I mean? So I appreciate you encouraging me to talk about it. Yeah, thanks.